That is the flexibility of subjects with multiple entry and exit and less of inspection, hopefully. In the light of the above, I'd like to reach out to Rahul first. Rahul, you have proposed balanced schooling, which gives equal importance to academic and non-academic curriculum. In the context of what we are experiencing right now, could you take us through your approach of learn, reinforce, practice, and apply before COVID and after COVID, and how this methodology makes sense or is relevant even today?
Good morning, everybody. So over the last 2 years, even pre-COVID, we've been investing in with the objective that apart from the learn, reinforce, practice, and apply concepts, we've also been investing behind the idea of personalized learning, so that every child has his or her own learning style, has his or her own learning journey, and we've been trying to use technology in order to make that possible. This has been in the works, like I said, for the last 2 years, and therefore in March, when we had to shift over into an online form of learning, it seemed reasonably seamless to us, at least on the Euroschool side. We also have another group of schools called the Billabong High International Schools, and there we have a slightly different philosophy. But rather than the LRPA model, really what we've been focusing on is personalization. And that really, the journey there has been one where the learning path for each student using technology. And that means that we've got a system which we had developed, which is now across all of our 20,000 students. It's really, we've implemented this across all of our 20,000 students, and that captures each student's learning journey, and therefore makes our curriculum, it adapts our curriculum to each student's journey. And that's really what we've been focusing on for the past 3 months as well. So while we, in the next 6 months or so, hopefully students will come back to school, the idea of personalization will remain. That's what we focused on.
Okay. Thank you for the perspective. Let me come back to Vishnu now. Vishnu, can you hear me?
Yes, very well, Deepshankar.
Okay. In this context, we have, what you have been doing in the heritage group of schools. There seems to be an implication in the new world order, more on innovation and creativity, and around the instructional core, which is the student, teacher, and content. How has been your experience in this context, especially during this pandemic, and how do you see this evolving post the pandemic?
So Devshankar, I'm not sure I understood your question right. I'm just going to paraphrase just to ensure I've understood your question. So what I heard you say is, given the focus on innovation around instruction, leadership, around student, teacher, content, curriculum, how do you see that evolving? Is that your broad question?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
No, I can speak for 6 hours on this right now. It's quite a wide question, and it's a very interesting topic too. So we don't see at heritage schools, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would agree to this, we don't see COVID as the reason to change something with what we want to do. If at all anything, COVID has probably given a sense of urgency to do certain things. The many things with the heritage schools, which has been doing over the last 4 or 5 months, probably got there in 4 or 5 months, which others would have taken 4 or 5 years. And so, in fact, one of the themes we've been telling our parents is this is a God-given opportunity for educators, because much of the reform around personalization, much of the reform around making students leaders of their own learning, much of the reforms around peer collaborations, I think is possible because of the excuse COVID has provided us. So yeah, in our mind, it is not. I don't think any direction has changed because of COVID, because of this pandemic. But definitely the pace has changed towards what we wanted to do. And I can just spend a couple of minutes what would that destination looks like in it. For us, it clearly is, we're a project-based learning school. Just to give a context to the audience who might have not understood what Heritage Schools does, that we, much of our curriculum is through integrated projects. We don't have standard assessments till grade 9. We don't have textbooks till grade 9. We only have integrated projects which children do those projects, and those projects are rooted in the community, which are interdisciplinary and has the typical product life cycle of any product development would look like, which is around multiple drafts. We've got to create prototypes. There's a focus on building a final student product or an authentic audience. And your assessment is based on those products. Of course, you also have certain modules like mathematics, which gets a little complicated to integrate to projects. So there are strands which runs as workshop modules. So that's the broad context. It's not the traditional CBSE school one would have experienced in an average setting. So for us, our destination and dream, like many of my colleagues would share, is around helping students pursue a personalized path, helping students to pursue certain achieve mastery in areas which have promised them to do, and also helping teachers also designing curriculum which is student led rather than a lecture mode led, which is just content focused. Another area which have really focused a lot over the last 2 or 3 years is around using assessment data points, helping data to inform some of our practices. It has all been a theoretical construct, but in the last 6 months, especially because of online teacher observations and online assessments, which is happening, we're able to gather some of the data and we're able to create dashboards which informs our practice in terms of which student is moving ahead, which group of students are not catching up, where do we need more support, and things like that. So these are the broad 2 areas where we've been able to do a lot more pace in terms of our reform.
Okay. And would you like to touch upon assessment, because I presume a very important dimension of what we do can be captured through how we conduct assessments for our children.
Actually, I'm so glad you asked, Dev Shankar, because much of the narrative on reform is always around curriculum. Mm-hmm. And my argument is that's the wrong place to start. You've got to start with assessments to do any reform, because assessment informs curriculum. In that sense, NEP is a great move forward, because there is a tremendous focus on output-based tracking, and there are some institutional setup which the NEP is provide. So from our perspective, it all begins with assessments. If your assessment is defined by standardized test, then teaching will happen to the test. Students will learn everything to the test, and nothing to do with what they. There is no space for engagement in that sense. So assessments has to be multiple fold. It should be around competency based, not just around content. So in our view, we have about 21 competencies, and there's a spiraling competency which starts from nursery to grade 3, and then from grade 4 to grade 8, and 9 to 12. Some are overlapping. These competencies also have what we call the human framework, which also has competencies around self-awareness, capacity to relate, sense of purpose, citizenship, and things like that. And we measure and observe some of these competencies over a period of time. For certain standardized markers like numeracy and literacy, we just used well-established, credible, and reliable third-party assessments. Now we have worked together to put a platform which brings all these data points together, where there is also a longitudinal study of where students are progressing and where they're not progressing. Of course, it is not perfect, because one of the problems with data is there's so much of data you don't know what to do with the data. We're still figuring out what to do with the data. Because some of the models of data analysis, unfortunately, is from the Western world, especially around the US, and Australia has done a lot of work. But those are not relevant to small private schools. I mean, some of the groups here are not small, but it is still small from a public school domain perspective, we still have about 10,000, 20,000 students. That's still not big in the world of public schools. Many districts probably operate 10 times more than those numbers. The kind of data they have is phenomenal. The data sets Indian private schools have is very limited for us to do any meaningful work. But I'm hoping that in some time, if schools get together, if there is a consensus about how to use data, we'll probably have large data sets to do some meaningful work.
Thank you. Thanks for this perspective. Let me come to Sunita. And she began her career as a teacher, and I believe that she's still a teacher at heart, and she has a very interesting journey with Kunskapsskolen. But Sunita, under the in the new world order, and I'm talking about pre-COVID and post-COVID, and predominantly around after this pandemic is over, how do you see the role of the teachers changing with more focus towards coaching, mentoring, and facilitating the student?
Well, thanks for asking that. But I think, so if I was to speak from Kunskapsskolen's perspective, honestly speaking, the COVID hasn't really made much of a difference in our approach to what we are doing inside schools, right? So personalizing education was always a part of the way we approached learning. It was always goal-centered. It was always based on strategies. It was always allowing children a lot of ownership and agency. Because at the core of it, what we believe is that children need to feel that they have control over what they're doing inside their classrooms, sure, or what they are working towards achieving. And therefore, you cannot the one size fits all does not work. And that I think all of us agree. I mean, say anybody who is in education today will completely agree that it doesn't happen anymore. Kids today have got a lot of, there need to be a voice to their learning. They need to be able to voice that. And I think that's very, very important. So for us, the pre-COVID or the post-COVID did not make much of a difference because we were digitally there. Like in some of the cases, we don't have textbooks in our school till grade 9. We have a learning portal which the students access. So every content that they need is available for them on that learning portal. So for a student to move from face-to-face classes in a physical environment to a virtual environment was not a problem at all. But because we were personalizing education, the teachers also had to work in that manner. There was no way they could have taught, the standard lecture mode didactic approach wouldn't have worked at all. So therefore, they had to be trained to be aware of where the children were in their learning journey. How is it you could move them from one level of learning to another level of learning? The other bit was in our school, children learn at their own pace. So already in our class, you do not have everybody learning the same content or in the same manner. So therefore, differentiated instruction was already a part of our system, in the way we do things. So, right, if I was to look at a post-COVID, for us specifically, I don't see a significant change. I will definitely say that the teachers have become a lot more tech savvy. They've learned to use a lot more applications. And we have had to train them in some of these applications that we have introduced. We wanted the online not to be a very teacher-driven one. We wanted a lot more interaction. We wanted a student engagement. That cannot happen if it's directed by. The teachers had to learn how to provide that engagement, that opportunity through different applications or different platforms that are there available today. If I were to look at what will happen once the teachers come back to school, I think there's a huge learning for us in that sense, because I find that the students have become a lot engaged, a lot more driven, because now there is no teacher or, after them saying, finish your tasks, submit
That's right.
them. That's all gone now.
Hmm.
Now it's all about, you take on the responsibility of submitting your assignments. You take on the responsibility of ensuring that you've got feedback from the teacher and you work on that feedback. So I think it has changed the way students are also looking at learning. And so I think it will be a very interesting experience when they both come back to school. And the learnings that we have taken from the, virtual model that we're following right now, I think needs to be implemented in some part to the face-to-face model. And I think that is going to be the way forward for our teachers too. So that's what I tend to see. I was quite listening to Vishnu talk about assessments and the start point being assessments. I think it's very, very important for students to understand where they are in their learning. And therefore, if the teacher is able to make the learning visible to the student, then the child is also able to, the student is able to understand exactly what have I learned, how much have I gained, what is it that I need to do more in order to be able to achieve the goal I've set for myself. And I think those are important conversations to have with our students. As teachers in our school, personal coaching was a part of our life. Every day, our teachers meet our students. So if you look at the way Kunskapsskolan is put together as a model, our students meet their base group teacher, as we call them, for 15 minutes in a week. During those 15 minutes, the conversation is usually about what did you accomplish the previous week? What were your goals? What were the strategies that you used in order to achieve those goals? And what are you planning to do for the next week? So they've always been coaches in our environment. They have to be coaches. So personal coaching is a part of the expectation from our teacher to be. Right? And so you have to be a subject teacher, but more importantly, you have to be a coach. So yes, mentoring, coaching, teaching, facilitating, I think it's a part and parcel of who a Kunskapsskolan teacher is. If I was to look at it outside the Kunskapsskolan model, and I'm talking about the education fraternity in general, I'd say that's time we did that. It's high time we got teachers to start understanding that students learn better if you facilitate it rather than if you teach down to them.
Thank you. Thank you for that
Yeah.
perspective. Really enjoyed listening. And with that, let me come to Jairam, where he has the opportunity of managing a very large number of schools. In this context, for especially, let's talk about the change in the parents' role. And I believe that parents are now more in the classroom, and I'd like to believe that they would become better consumers of school services. Jairam, do you agree with this assessment, especially with in the new age? Hello?
No, I'll just. Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible now, Jairam. We can hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for that. And so let me just start by introducing Edunation Services Private Limited. Basically, we are the erstwhile Pearson schools, and then last year we got bought over by a consortium of Ryan Group of Schools, which all of us know, and Foundation Holding, which is a private equity based in Middle East. And then, so we just completed about a year in terms of this new entity. So Edunation comes from educating the nation, and the desire is to kind of expand the whole RAN network and take it to every district in the country. So that's just a context to Edunation services. So I think it was very interesting listening to all three of my colleagues to prior to this, because they touched upon a few things which are extremely close to heart, especially what Vishnu said around assessment, because I'm a firm believer that the journey begins once you assess, which is exactly what Vishnu said. And I was very closely involved with designing the assessment system at Pearson. So coming back to your point on parents becoming an integral part of the system, I think if I were to think of, let's say when we studied and the parents now, there is a significant shift in the way parents are getting involved in the process, uh, mostly for the right reasons. Because I think today it's very important to have parents as partners in progress. Because, like some of my colleagues said, and again, uh, many years back, I had kind of explored heritage as well. And one of the things is that each one of us is trying to explore new ways of learning. So it's very important to have all the stakeholders, whether it's teachers, students, parents, to be an integral part of that process. So you can't really think of a school ecosystem which does not involve one of these three stakeholders or does not involve parents. So parents, of course, have become an extremely integral part of this process. For example, in many of our schools and in various other schools that I see outside, parents are in fact responsible for organizing some of the large events in the school. The PTAs, for example, during this crisis over the last 3-4 months, I would say that they have played an extremely significant role in all our schools, because so obviously this has been, I would say, a different time, not so much challenging, but a very different time. And I think all the work that we had done with students, parents, teachers has come together. So we have kind of worked very, very closely with the parents, whether it was setting off the virtual learning, whether it was kind of getting them involved in the whole school process. Because again, we also have to remember that our homes in India are really not geared for learning from home or work from home in that manner. So obviously, the parents have a huge role to play in ensuring that they have that ecosystem, whether it's the environment at home, or whether it's the connectivity at home, or whether the devices at home. Again, these might be very basic things, but I think they have played an extremely integral role. We, in fact, and like Rahul said, we have been working on blended learning for a long time. And very recently, we have rolled out a learning management system. We've just taken it to about 50,000 children in the last 3 to 4 weeks. So this is a detailed learning management system. And again, this was not planned for COVID. It just happened during COVID. And because I just see blended learning as being the way forward. So as we go forward, I think blended learning is going to be the way forward. And parents have actually played a very, very big role in embracing this change. Because I think other than it being personalized, it also allows parents and teachers and the whole fraternity to come together. So I think parents overall have played a very, very significant role overall, not just in the COVID scenario. And one other small example is, for instance, like some of my colleagues said, of course, nothing has changed in the virtual world in terms of learning or in terms of running the operations. And we just concluded our annual awards. And this was, obviously, there were schools which had 3,000 children, and they had to conduct annual awards. And it went over 3-4 days because you had to do multiple sessions. But the parents were absolutely a part of it, like they would be in the school. And it was really heartening to hear from them about all the good stuff that is happening and how they are enjoying. So to your point, Dave, I think they have been an integral part, and they should be an integral part of this whole journey.
Okay. Thanks, Jairam. Thanks for your perspective. I wanted to understand from you in slightly more detail that today, when the classes are, moving predominantly online, parents are also participating in these classes. Okay, and in our assessment, we believe that they will become better consumers of school services. In the past, it was probably restricted, and you rightly mentioned to the PTAs, to the various other forums, structured forums that we had for interaction. But today, parents are becoming an integral part of our delivery. In that context, would you like to shed some light on it?
Yeah, so I'm going to take this out of our school in a larger perspective now. And again, I think all of us panelists on this are fortunate to be, I would say, running schools where there are parents who are fairly well off and they come and attend the schools. But when I look at the broader picture of really taking education to the larger audience, for example, I just see that even at a lot of government schools, so there are people who kind of help us at home, their children are also on this whole virtual platform, and they are very, and they are not as privileged as some of us. And therefore, when I look at them and see how they are dealing with the situation and how involved they are, it's extremely encouraging, because this is not just limited to a handful of schools. Because I think the key is really, like the policy says, right, get to a gross enrollment ratio in schools of 100% by 2030. And I think this radically kind of changes the perspective on that. And these are people who necessarily are not the most privileged, but they are very keen to educate their children. And when I talk to them and when I see them, I think there is no difference between kids in our school and kids in their school today studying, and the parents are equally involved. Though the parents, the children in their homes might be first generation learners, but it's very interesting to see that how they kind of are deeply engaged with the process, and how they are looking for devices, and how they kind of want to support the whole process. So I think this is going just beyond a network of some of our schools, but even if I look at it across India, to all people who have limited access, I think everywhere the parents are getting very involved, and I think it's almost like a revolution, right? So as you go forward, and if you want to be the next big developed economy in the world, I think education is the key. And therefore, like someone said, all the 240 million children, why 240? I think all the 330 million students in India need to be on that path.
Yes.
Kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Rajiv, given your experience, today managing the stakeholder engagement and communication is a very important ingredient in our success, and especially with that perspective, how do you see this evolving with respect to students, parents, teachers, board, the regulatory authorities, as well as communities?
Thank you, Deb, and good morning to all my colleagues. I'm Rajiv, and just for everybody's information, North Anglia education is represented by Oak Ridge International Schools in India. So that will be an easier connect, because most of you would be aware with Oak Ridge International Schools. North Anglia is a global company, and we've got 66 schools with 66,000 students across the globe. And in India, we've got 5 Oak Ridge schools and roughly about 7,500 students. So thank you, Dev, for taking this topic on communication. I think one thing, from a people's perspective, which has changed dramatically is the aspect of communication. Because it is very easy, when you have students in your class or parents coming to your school, or you have various forums where you can get them together and have a face-to-face conversation. Now, a face-to-face conversation is replaced with a digital conversation. Now, that is not as simple as it is said, and it is not as effective also as we say. Because it is, from an HR perspective, it is more of an emotional understanding and an emotional connect rather than the technical aspect of having a dialogue for 15 minutes and saying the dialogue is over. So the response mechanisms have to be different. And therefore, while we had certain structured methods of engaging the staff along with the parents and the other stakeholders, we have seen some amount of transformation happening in those. And thankfully, the set of parents that we have are well qualified, as some of my other esteemed colleagues also mentioned. The parent community is fairly evolved in the larger sector of the private schools. So it is, the transition has been that much more easier and effective to involve parent and to have a open and transparent communication. In fact, I would say that this whole experience of post-COVID has actually made the organization much more transparent, because we want to be, what generally happens from a human psychology is when you're next to each other, you understand. When you're not next to each other, you tend to speak more. And therefore, if you attend many of these webinars, even if the point has been made, the speaker tries to repeat the same point in 3 or 4 ways, just to feel assured that the audience has understood, because there are few methods to get a cue that the point has been relayed and has been communicated the way the speaker wanted to speak. So this has led to where both the parents and the teachers and the student and all the community having more amount of interaction. So the interaction has increased, and the more you communicate, the more it is effective. I mean, it is very simple. Over communication is better than under communication. The next point that I want to talk about in terms of how this has effectively changed is, for me, fundamentally, I come from a hardcore business background for first 12 years of my career, and the next 12 years of my career I've been into HR. And one thing that I have realized is, when we speak of running a particular business, then we also treat human as one of the resource line items. For me, human is not a resource. As long as we understand this, that human is not a resource, just like any other commodity that we would spend, our approach towards the entire, people, our own staff, and to parents and students will change significantly. And I think that this point should be fundamentally the premise before you start any of your, expectation management or communication management with the outside stakeholders. That's my 2 words. Thank you.
Well said, Rajiv. Thank you so much. And it's a refreshing change, because one was the communication part of it. The second is an engagement, which is slightly as a part long term. And do you see that our engagement with the communities, beyond the school, will also undergo a change than what it was in the past?
See, my take on this, Dev, is that schools are not, typical. Just to give a parallel industry example, any fast-moving good, which are seasonal. Like, for example, there is a festival which comes like Diwali, you will buy some stuff, or any other festival comes, Christmas, you will buy some stuff. Those are seasonal. They are not there forever. Education is far more beyond that, right? Anybody who is into education is right from his birth, right up to his graduation from the school, then to high school. And we also have the philosophy that lifelong learner, that you are. So therefore, the engagement, whatever we do on a day-to-day basis, the transactional value of that will not significantly impact that much on a long-term basis, because the school as a brand has been established. Be it heritage schools, be it the Euro group of schools, or any other brand that we talk about over here, all these have been there for quite a significant number of time, and the engagement is associated more with the school brand. The representation of that, the quality of the engagement definitely is coming from the person who interacts, but the brand per se itself holds the engagement to a very different level. That's the way I would like to put it. And therefore the person who interacts will either take the brand value upwards, which means the engagement has been effective and therefore the brand is further strengthened, or the person has not been able to be effective in the engagement and therefore the brand comes down. However, this brand going up and down does not significantly change the decision making of the parent, unless it is a very extreme cause of concern, where the parent is significantly worried about the safety or security or growth of the child getting impacted over there. So therefore, to me, the entire engagement, does not, just change because of these small transactions, but it is because the parent is assured that they are partnering with a well-established person, a brand, and therefore the engagement will be good on a larger perspective.
Okay. Thank you. Ranjan, if, given your experience and given what we are experiencing right now, there seems to be a significant constraints around the various resources that we have, whether it is in terms of budget, whether it is in terms of time, people, and the facility that we have. How do you, in the new world order, going forward, how do you see the schools managing these resources much better?
I think, so that's a very, very relevant question at this point of time, not just for us as an organization, but for also the larger K-12 as well as the pre-primary school space across the country, because the K-12 school system really also encompasses the pre-primary space to some extent. Essentially, let me just take a minute to tell you about what we do at our organization. So Advanced Preschools runs two brands of pre-primary schools, both positioned at the high end. One brand is called Vivero International, and we have a bunch of about 20 schools across the country. And the second brand is called Serra International, which is more of a franchise brand. So I think traditionally what has happened in the K-12 space in India, as well as the pre-primary space, is that there have been standalone units more than groups of schools or preschools. And in standalone schools, because each of the promoters had a different thought process, I think the efficiency with which the K-12 school system or the preschool system in the country was being run was not necessarily optimal from a resource utilization perspective, since you asked about resources specifically. Now, I think over the last 12 years that I've seen the sector closely, I have seen that there has been some amount of efficiency improvement that has happened, not just in terms of these groups of professional chains coming in, but also in terms of the standalone schools and the way they're looking at their business and education. So this has led to better resource utilization and better business outcomes, but more importantly, this has also counterintuitively led to better student outcomes and better learning for students. So it's not as if business is actually at cross purposes with student learning. And that's what my experience of the last 12 years has proved. Now, what COVID has done, specifically to your question, is that COVID has forced the entire industry to actually be much more mindful of how it's utilizing its limited resources. Now, schooling as an industry is not a very large industry compared to some of the other industries in the country. As someone recently pointed out, I'm talking about private schooling here. So I think it's forced all of us to, whether it is how we measure our people's performance and how we allocate tasks to them in terms of the time utilization, or it's in terms of space utilization in our schools and physical infrastructures, or it's in terms of how we structure learning, or it's in terms of how we allocate budgets and where do we actually emphasize budgets? Are we emphasizing budgets on marketing, or are we emphasizing budgets on learning? These can be two very different things. And actually, very many school groups in the country don't actually emphasize, put significant chunks of their budget into the learning aspect of schools, which is also important and which also acts as a marketing dollar indirectly. So I think it's just the COVID has forced all school systems in the country to wake up to the new reality and to become much more efficient in terms of following some basic management principles, which I think have not been applied to a very large extent in the schooling industry thus far. And I think that's something that will go far in terms of increasing productivity, efficiency, and therefore learning outcomes for students in the country. And the second thing that I'd like to say here is that COVID has also forced some of the inefficient players to actually move out of the ecosystem. So there's news of many, specifically if I was to talk about pre-primary schools, there's news of over 1,000 preschools in the country today having already been shut because they have not been able to manage their finances and their budgets and their resources effectively in this COVID period. And also it's already starting to lead to some amount of consolidation in the industry, which who knows whether it will be for the good or the bad. But my belief is that, you know, parents will eventually gravitate towards more professional systems, more well-managed preschool and school systems. And therefore, I think the entire sector will stand to gain as a result of the ensuing professionalism.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Ranjan. And let me come to you know, a topic which is you know, is being debated right now, and I'd like to have perspective from Rahul on this. That you know, there seems to be some discussion, you know, both online and offline, with regard to the fees that is being charged under the current circumstances. So how do you, how is your group of schools actually managing that's important stakeholder communication with the parents in the light of what we see happening in the environment?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So this is clearly a sensitive issue, and we are cognizant of the fact that there is pain out there. Many people have either lost their jobs or taken significant pay cuts, and we have to be first of all sensitive to that. I think that goes a long way in setting the tone of all communication. What particularly within our group, we've been clear about following all of the legal guidance. So although in some cases courts have stayed much of the guidance that has come out from state governments, we've been proactively, even before that came out, we sent out communications saying there will be no fee hikes, for example. And that's something that we've been very clear about. The other part of whether fees need to be paid or not is, I think, at a rational level, most parents understand that for any organization, whether it is a school or any other organization, unless there is some inflow into the organization, it's difficult to sustain operations. That is, I think, at least in 95% of cases, very clear to parents, and most therefore have cooperated. I think where sensitivity is required is in taking into account certain personal situations, so that we can help in terms of the schedule of payments. And that's where we've been extremely flexible. We've worked actually on a one-on-one basis with several parents as well, and that has resulted in us being in a good position on that. I think for the most part, we've also therefore had significant support from parents on that issue as well. For example, when certain state governments passed resolutions banning even collection of fees, a substantial portion of our parent body came out in support and said, without that, it's not possible to provide the education that we're doing. The other part, I think, is also, particularly at this point in time, to have to show value. Ultimately, I don't think people are averse to paying as long as they realize that there is some value to what they're paying for.
Right.
And in this situation, it is actually very transparent. In many cases, I mean, previously, parents used to send their students to school, and really it was a little bit of a black box, right? They didn't know exactly what happened. Here, everything is extremely transparent, and therefore it is it's our onus also. The onus is on us to really invest substantially behind technology, behind our people, in order to make sure that that value is delivered, even in an online context, and is visible. And if that is, I think, done, then for the most part, most of the parent body will end up supporting the institution. And this happens, I think, at all price points. It's not necessarily at premium price points, but across the chain. If there is, if the tone of communication is right, if the transparency exists, and one keeps investing in making sure that learning outcomes are happening and are visible, I think we will cross this path.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your perspective, Rahul. Uh, Vishnu, this question is in context of the very large number of students that you address in one single institution, and this is I'm talking basis the outcome that we are all aware of Benjamin Bloom's 2 sigma improvement, that combining synchronous and asynchronous leads to greater personalization. In the context of large number of children in a unit, in a school, how do you approach this issue?
You mean to how do you merge the balance between synchronous and asynchronous? Is that
Yes,
what
for a very large number of children.
Students,
in a
children, yeah. So one, of course, I'm talking from a perspective of a privileged private school, because in India, most of schools actually don't have the context in which all of us operate in this platform. So in fact, when we share, we really have to be careful of what we are sharing, because in what context you come from, because that kind of changes the answer entirely. So from a private urban K-12 school group perspective, I think for us, it is about what makes education meaningful. And that's the starting point for us. What makes education more authentic and real for our children? What makes them to build the skills, right? So that will define the design question: what is synchronous, what is asynchronous? And I'm talking not in a COVID scenario, I'm talking in a post-COVID scenario, when hopefully in probably about 9 months, I'm not expecting anywhere between 6 months, but let's say about 9 months to 1 year, we are back to physical classes in it. But even then, I think that the deciding factor is what is to be learned and what is the context in it. Much of the things which we are spending precious physical infrastructure and physical class time can actually be done at home by children on their own in it. So a lot of it can go. But some of the core skills that require certain mastery, that require a certain coaching and internship model, that requires a lot of peer collaboration and working, that gets moved to an asynchronous or a synchronous or a live class session in itself. So the way we look at it is just relook at the curriculum, focus on what is core, what is non-core. Non-core gets moved to a self-paced synchronous format, and the core is what you get sufficient attention in. I think Sunita talked about personalized learning pathways in it, and I think that's also the future, where you have to have a learning platform where there are subject portals, where you're connected not just with folks in your campus, but probably experts around the world. You're able to take courses based on the mastery tracks you want. There is a lot of personalization which happens. I think Benjamin Bloom talks a lot about it too, where people move from mastery of concepts on their own in a certain pace in it. I don't know if I've answered your question, Dev Shankar, but largely I think the curriculum will define some of these decisions between synchronous and asynchronous work.
Yeah, if you could talk about the kind of infrastructure that you have put in place to enable this happen.
Actually, the great question which I don't know answers to. I'll tell you why. As we are expanding right now, this COVID has also made us realize that you can actually do a lot more with a lot less.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, when we used to have 70, 80 square foot per child in a certain physical infrastructure, now you think that you can actually pretty much do the same stuff with 1/3 of the work. So I would, in fact, we are now in active conversation with internally in a couple of new projects to actually reduce the need for physical infrastructure in it. So I really don't know. Maybe after a month or 2 months, I'll have better answers to this question. But definitely, the old models of a linear approach of a certain physical infrastructure doesn't require, especially in a country like India, where capital. I mean, one of the biggest problems with any industry which is so capital intensive, like schools in this case, uh, uh, we pay a lot for physical infrastructure than many other nations do. It is expensive to run a school here because purely because of the investment you require on the physical space. But what if the new equation demands less of that? Then it throws up multiple opportunities for you, and which one could pursue. So we are rethinking it. That's my quick question to you. Of course, that means that we are also augmenting a lot in the technology space, which means we used to have a learning management system for the last 5 years. Now we are really completely revamping it to make it far more the UI should be far more agile and easier. In fact, one big realization I have right now is it is not the functionality and features which is important. It is the ease of use. I mean, you could have an Android phone which 1,000 features.
Absolutely.
It doesn't beat the ease of use what an Apple provides, which still doesn't have even half the features of what Android has. So possibly we don't want to do lot in tech, but have a few things that should really do well. Of course, for me, assessment is a huge lever, collecting data on assessment and providing that. I think Sunita said this point beautifully, that children should see their progress. That's one of the objectives of any data tracking of assessments. Parents should see their progress, which make learning visible. So our focus will largely be on technology and training rather than on physical infrastructure right now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vishnu. Sunita, if I could come to you quickly, given that the learning outcomes, there is no change in the learning outcomes that we are looking at. And there is a disproportionate focus now on online delivery. What are the key interventions that you are doing to build capabilities in teachers? At the end of the day, we all agree that that is the most important ingredient for success.
Sorry about that. I realized I'm muted. Yeah. So I think definitely the empowerment of the teacher is at the core of a successful classroom delivery or a student achieving their learning outcomes. That I think is something that everybody here will agree. We need to make the teachers a lot more aware of changes that are happening. Training, I think, is the core of it all. We as, you need to spend a lot of time, energy on providing the teachers with necessary skills in this environment. Because yes, while the teachers have understood teaching, learning, they are now in a very different environment. They have to look, if I was to look at a teacher from a very simplistic point of view, when I'm in a classroom, I know exactly what's happening with my child or my group of children inside a classroom. I am able to see from their body language, from the way they behave, from the way they interact with their peers, what's happening with them. And I'm able to cater to that inside my classroom. Today, that is out of my spectrum. While I can see their faces, that engagement, that connect, is minimal compared to what it was when it was in a classroom. So I am, in a way, blindsided to a certain extent. So as a teacher, how do I deal with that? How do I ensure that what I am teaching is being connected to by the student? So therefore, there has to be a greater engagement with the student outside the virtual classroom platform. right? So when you were speaking about communication, I think that's very key. What's the communication that's happening between the teacher and the student? Is there an engagement space, an opportunity for a student to be able to connect with the teacher and say, okay, I haven't understood this. Can it be retaught? Or can you explain it to me? Or can you give me additional material that I need? Now, if all of that has to be done by a teacher, the teacher needs to be given the skill sets to be able to do that. And that can't be done without training. Just by telling them that's what they need to do is not good enough. You need to teach them how to do it and how to do it effectively. And so therefore, I think it's very important today for ensuring that we set aside certain amount of resources towards empowering teachers. I think that's becoming more and more relevant today. I think that's where I come from.
Is there any specific that you could probably highlight? Anything that you are doing differently right now than what you did in the past?
Well, I do know that online has made it easier in a way for us as school leaders to be able to be inside a classroom. So today, on an average, I'm able to step into schools across, we've got 4 schools across the geographical boundaries. Earlier, I had to travel to those schools to be inside a classroom. They're sitting here in Gurgaon. I'm able to step into all classrooms across the school at any point and evaluate what's happening inside a class. And then take a teacher and give them the necessary feedback in order to improve and say, okay, fine, this is what I saw. This is what I think needs to be done. Would you need any help on that? Right? So would you want somebody to support you in the way you're using technology, for example? Or do you want support in knowing how to help children collaborate a little better? Right? Or are there some classroom management techniques or leadership techniques that you want advice on? Because on online platform, that's another area that teachers are struggling a little bit with. So do they need some support in that area? So it's now easier, and now I can pull resources. I think what for us in Kunskap School we have seen is that there's been a larger amount of sharing of best practices across schools. So if I have a school that has got a certain strength, I'm able to connect the school leaders, I'm able to get them to observe classes, give feedback, conduct training sessions. So that entire process of getting everybody to grow and develop together is what I'm seeing in our organization.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. Rajiv, if I could come to you, and how do you think, what are the new skill sets that you'd be looking at when you are going to look at hiring in the new post-COVID?
Well, I don't think any particular dimension of that will change. There is a very good structural framework of teacher selection and teacher recruitment, and I'm sure most of the schools must be already using psychological test or any form of method of checking, what the person's thought process is towards the, is it student centric, is it child centric, or education centric, or no. So that kind of test will continue. Some of things that we are going to further strengthen is ability to deal with ambiguity, because this one COVID thing has shown us, that most of us were very structured in our approach, but if something like this comes up, how you're able to take it emotionally and deal with a lot of ambiguity. Because right now also, as we speak, we are still not sure of when the school is going to really open, when the kids will be able to come back, and how do we deal. So at a management level, it is fairly more mature, but at a ground level, I'm sure there are conversations where they are feeling pressurized and tense, and these local conversations would be happening in terms of how to deal with these things. So I think it's a responsibility of ours, not only as HR but as management, to reach out to them and give them build those competencies in terms of being able to deal with ambiguity. And also, as Sunita mentioned earlier, and Vishnu mentioned, a huge shift is there towards technology. Fortunately, most of our teachers are able to adapt quickly, but there would be, that Ranjan pointed out, there is still a larger set of schools, where teachers would be finding it very difficult to adopt to newer technologies. So how do we, bring them more, tech savvy? And because that is the need of the hour. And last but not the least is, ability to deal with oneself. I think that is very important. These COVID kind of situations we have seen has put a lot of stress to oneself, because if anything happens in your building, in your society, in your neighbor flat or your own flat, I mean, your mind is completely changed. Earlier, if somebody would have fallen sick, you were not so much concerned. You would continue to do your duty. But now being at home, and if you have somebody in your family under quarantine or getting tested, or just the fact that you are sick now, you just presume that you have COVID. And just the mindset starts thinking that, oh, I'm having fever means I'm having, COVID. So it's about, a lot of employee well-being, and therefore, working with the staff to, have that confidence in themselves. So these are some of the parameters, what we will, reverse engineer to check whether if we put a particular employee into this situation, how will she or he respond to those situations and how will they be able to take it. So I'm sure some technological solutions will also come here in terms of assessment and how effectively we can do those assessments. But so these are the things that I think we will have to focus on.
Well, thank you, Rajiv. The thing that also presents as an opportunity is that if technology can actually make geographical distance disappear, and by that I mean that today schools have an opportunity to look at resources well beyond their scope, what was there in the past. How do you look at that situation from your perspective as an HR professional?
I think it's a very welcome sign. And we had already started this journey of bringing in faculty since our acquisition happened in February 2019. Almost 18 months have passed. So we had looked at this opportunity to bring in the best of the world's faculty online to our Indian students, because that opportunity was available. So I think for a teacher, from a teacher perspective, it is a fantastic opportunity because you're able to reach out to a larger set of audience, and therefore your value goes up and you get that gratification and also a sense of satisfaction that you've been able to impact many more students than your given fixed classroom, a batch of 20 or 25. You could reach out to many more thanks to this technology. And from a management perspective, I think it is what Rahul said is bang on. It has become that much more transparent now, and I think Sunita also touched upon it. Sitting from one place here, I have a dashboard where I can see all the 5 schools and I can exactly know what's happening at what point of time. So it's therefore it is that much more effective to manage, and you don't have to wait for reports to come 48 hours later, 72 hours later. There is live reporting that is happening, and therefore you can be that much more quicker and faster in your response to the situations that your team is facing.
Okay, thank you very much, Ranjan. We have a paucity of time, but I'd like to have your perspective, on the operational side of the business, and especially with regard to the facility that we have, the kind of maintenance that we undertake, the transportation services that we provide, or the food services that we provide in our schools. In the light of what we are experiencing, how do you see these aspects changing?
So I think there's one short-term view and there's a long-term view that I have. So I think from a short-term view perspective, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
So from a short-term view perspective, I think things are going to change drastically. What I mean by that is, so when you look at kitchens in schools, or when you look at, let's say, dining areas in schools, or you look at transportation services, right? Many of these, just like classrooms, would involve children to be sitting in close proximity to each other, especially on the transportation side. And therefore, in the short term, I think each of us, whether it's K-12 schools or preschools, will have to think of alternate models of actually delivering those services. And obviously a simplistic answer could be to not provide those services at all, but that doesn't make any sense. So it has to be a win-win situation for school managements as well as parents. And school managements have to therefore be innovative on the operational side of managing schools. And therefore, I think that would be my short-term view. From a long-term view perspective, I think who knows? Who knows how long the COVID impact lasts, and whether schools would choose to go back to how things always were, or whether schools would choose to fundamentally change things the way education itself is changing. But my guess is that there are bound to be some fundamental changes given the long period of time that I expect COVID to impact our ecosystem. I expect a few of these operational things will fundamentally change moving forward. Maintenance, as you know, coming to maintenance, the point that you raised, is a function of the size of the infrastructure, and is also a function of at what quality level do you want to maintain your school. So I've seen schools which are completely not maintained at all, and I've seen schools which are maintained as well as five-star hotels. So I think some of where schools would like to prioritize their monies, and where schools would like to prioritize their positioning will also kind of need to change moving forward in the long term, is what my view is.
Okay. Okay. Now, before we end, I think it would be apt to take a quick feedback or understand your perspective on the new education policy. In my view, it definitely expands choice, and there is a great deal of empowerment that happens for the children. And if I could start off with Jairam. Jairam, your perspective quickly on the new education policy that has been announced.
I think it's definitely a huge step forward. I think it's a great vision document, and like always, I think the implementation will be key. And for a country of our size, I think it will take time for it to reach the lowest level. But I think it's an absolutely brilliant vision document. From my perspective, I think there are 2 or 3 key things that kind of stand out. So one is, I think it builds on the whole idea of experiential learning concept, taking children up the blooms and so on and so forth. So I think it deals with that. So that's one thing which is very, very critical. 2, I think the idea of making some of these assessments, including the board exams, low stake, for me is a good step forward, because it lends to the first point of actually making it more application based and so on and so forth. The third thing which I think it very importantly touches upon is the whole teaching fraternity, where I think there is something more which needs to be done, because how do you make it a profession of choice, right? Because today, when people go and study, how do you make teaching a profession of choice? I think that is very important. And the last thing which I found very interesting, which didn't get picked up by media too much, is there is a point on peer tutoring that they've made. Now obviously one needs to understand what they mean by peer tutoring, but I think it's a very, very powerful concept. It's like going to your seniors, superiors in school or otherwise. So peer tutoring, I think, is a extremely powerful concept, and it's new, and it will be very helpful. So those are my views there.
Thank you, Jairam. Quickly, can I come back to Rahul? Rahul, your views on the new education policy, and 1 or 2 things that really stands out.
So the one thing that I thought that really stood out for me, at least, is the flexibility that the new education policy really really provides to the entire sector, particularly in higher ed, I think. But eventually, it also, like Jairam mentioned, it finally trickles down into the school sector as well. the fact that exams, therefore, there doesn't need to be one high stakes exam, which is sort of the entry point into everything else. I think that allows for what we've been really talking about, I think most panelists here as well, which is holistic learning, which is, I think Vishnu mentioned, for example, the fact that the assessments need to be more comprehensive. And from there, everything flows back as well. So that flexibility at the higher ed level, I think, will definitely translate into holistic sort of education below as well. There's also, I think, mentions about what we spoke about earlier, personalization, use of technology. All of those are definitely positive steps ahead. I think in conjunction with state governments, if this is well implemented, it can be a big step forward.
Thank you. Thank you. What about Vishnu?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 hits and 2 misses in it. Quite controversial, but it's important to lay it out about what the policy didn't do in it. So broadly, we have to recognize much of what NEP says. There is certain prescriptions, recommendation, and some are policy implementation. So prescription recommendation will take its own sweet time. There'll be modulation, like for example, language. I think media also catches the wrong things in it. That one of the prescriptions is definitely the language, and a couple of other things, even collaborative learning, making subjects integrated. Those are prescriptions. We don't know when it's going to get implemented. It might very well be a vision document for the next 30 years, like the way NCF 2005 has been. But there are structural changes which the government has done in the NEP, which is highly commendable. One is separating the regulator from the operator. So we need to see, I've not seen the form and shape it's going to have, but the conversation around that there is going to be the regulator, that should be a pan-India or a national level and state level regulator of schools and private colleges, is a good step. Because problem with schools, and this is very unique to India, no large country has this, where the regulator of the school is also an operator, is also the assessor, which is in charge of running the board exams. Like a typical case in US, you have the SAT on the college board, which is not involved with running of schools. Here, CBSE does everything. So I think that separation in the long run will provide more accountability and better metrics in it. The second thing which I really like about what the NEP has done structurally is, of course, reducing setting up a separate body purely for assessments. The PARAK, the National Mission for Foundational Math and Literacy, those are big problems. In fact, in our country, we are so obsessed with higher education. It should be the other way around. We should have started with primary schools than IITs. It's a controversial statement to make, but we have to realize that countries like ours, we need more primary schools than IITs as a nation of 1.3 billion people. So starting some of these institutions responsible for measuring primary level readings assessment it's commendable. Again, that's a big shift towards output rather than input. The third big hit, which in my view, which most educators will agree, administrators might not agree, and parents might not agree, and media for sure will not agree, is the fact that the CBSE is talking about, not CBSE, I'm sorry, the NEP is talking about reducing the curriculum to the core. Our biggest challenge in this country is that the sheer load of content. I think it is, our infrastructure input is a third world nation's input, but our curriculum is a first world nation curriculum. It just doesn't match. Of course, you need to have variability. There are gifted kids, there are schools which is high up in the curve. You've got to customize those, but to force fit so much of content, look at the math content in 11 and 12. You disenfranchise 95% of Indian kids from taking math because you force every 11 and 12 kid to take differential calculus, which even engineers don't use in today's time. So I'm glad we are saying less is more. So that is a third one. There are two misses, of course. One clear miss, which I'm terribly upset about, and I'm sure a lot of us are upset about it, is not talking about the role of private schools and private universities in building this nation. 50 to 60%, conservative estimates say that private schools take care of our children. And the number of kids going to government schools is going. In fact, one of the unsaid, understated jewels of India is private schools. Think about the number of people we have produced who have gone on to bring fame to our nation, gone on to provide employment. Much of them come from private schools. Even if you come from public school setup, they probably be KVs, which is not a representative of public schools. So while there's a lot of talk at the bureaucratic level, we were part of some of those discussions with the government, with MHRD, with Niti Aayog, but we was pretty disappointed to see that there was not a courage. There's an intent, but they did not convert that intent into action by, in fact, they've gone one step backward. They've reinforced fee regulatory committees even for private universities in it. The second big miss, which I think they've made, is one, of course, extending ECCE, early childhood care, into universities of education. Why, as a policy, is a welcome move. It will benefit a lot of children, and I'm hoping they're going to shift early childhood from the Ministry of Health and Child Welfare to Ministry of Education. What is a big problem is preschools. I don't know whether RT is going to gobble up preschools. Preschools in our country operate. I don't have preschools, but I know several preschool operators will suffer. Preschool is a huge source of employment in our country. Now you're going to strangle that with if an RT is extended there without sufficient public support or public funding support to these small operators. I think it'll virtually kill that sector, which otherwise has been providing significant contribution to not just from an employment perspective, but also in terms of helping children reach their milestone, learning milestones.
Sure. Thanks. Sunita, quickly, if I could have your perspective too.
Well, I think a lot of what I believe in and I have been appreciative of has already been discussed. So I'm not going to repeat that. But I do know that as a document, it is pretty strong. At least it gives a great vision. Now it comes to the point of what exactly are the nitty-gritties of it? What exactly is the implementation process that's going to happen? And how is it going to be, in a sense, ensure that the quality of what is just, so one is to have a checkbox and say, okay, are we doing it? And we just go a checkbox saying done, done, done. And then the next point, of course, is to see at what quality level is that being done, right? So I think, and to be able to do that, I mean, so we're talking about experiential learning, we're talking about learning outcomes, we're talking about core competencies, we're saying all these things. What about the teachers? Are you preparing them for all of that? Because I think we don't want to have a repeat of a CCE situation where something got implemented and had to be taken off because of the lack of the entire teaching fraternity not being given the necessary skill sets to be able to implement all that is being envisioned. So I think for me, that as a teacher, I think that's coming out first, is the fact that yes, while the ideas are great, how are we going to implement it and how are we going to prepare the entire stakeholder community, whether it's the parent community or whether it's the teaching community, to be able to ensure that this gets implemented. It becomes very difficult for schools who want to do experiential learning, who want to look at learning outcomes and want to do skill formation. At the end, if the 99% still becomes the basis for a parent to say, okay, you're successful or not successful, it becomes challenging for any school to do it. So I think it's that is where I come from. So I agree a lot with what Vishnu said in terms of the hits and the misses. I do believe that those are areas that they could have focused on, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ranjan?
Yeah, so I think very similar views to most others, and specifically since currently I am with a preschool organization, specifically around Vishnu's point around extending RT. Obviously, what he's saying is absolutely right. But I think the bigger question is that if preschools in our country become more regulated by them coming under the new Ministry of Education as opposed to MHRD, then this regulation will actually help how children are learning in the country. Because, I'm not talking about size here, or I'm not talking about quality of infrastructure here. But I'm sure purely talking about the quality of teaching and learning that's happening in our preschools today. So by and large, in our country, we still, even though it's much better than what it used to be a decade back, but by and large, there's still a lot of scope for improvement in the early years, and we know how important the early years are to education more broadly. So I think if this sector becomes slightly regulated, and therefore there are norms that come in of what is a minimum acceptable quality of early childhood education in our country, or care, and they've gotten care also into the ambit now. It's called ECCE. I think the quality of the childcare services provided, daycares, and the quality of the preschool services provided will increase substantially, and therefore the end user would be the beneficiary. And it's all about educating children well, right? If you educate children well, then the future of the country is bright.
Sure, sure. Rajiv, your two bits on the new education policy. This requires a full day session, a much deeper discussion on it. It's not something that we can finish off in 2 minutes. But I want to understand your perspective, and if you could, there is this question that has come up. Would like to understand the HR process that you follow in your institution in India. I'm sure you take a lot of leverage from the best practices that are there beyond India. And if you could just help us summarize the key highlights of the new education policy and some of the highlights of your HR process of hiring talent.
Sure. Thanks for at the end mentioning hiring talent, because then that restricts and puts me into more focused. Otherwise, as an HR process, it's a very wide box, and there are many things that we can talk about it. And as Vishnu said in the beginning, he needs to spend 6 hours explaining that particular point. Even I can do that, beyond 6 hours, for this HR. But from a hiring talent perspective, as we say, and many of these jargons are already floating in social media, WhatsApp. We talked about IQ and EQ over the periods. It started with IQ, and then it evolved to become EQ as part of IQ, and then EQ taking over. And now we are seeing something called as SQ, which is more of a social quotient. So you see, it's the hiring which will be happening now onwards is how much of the person is able to live and deliver to the expectations of all the stakeholders in a very different kind of environment. And I'm intentionally not using the word virtual, because it happens to be virtual as of now, but tomorrow we don't know what other kind of situation might come, or in what form or shape this particular will change, and the delivery mechanisms will change. So few things to be very precise is adaptability, to the changes, dealing with ambiguity. Technology is a given; it's a must. Earlier, we used to take people and train them on technology. I think gone will be those days. We will have to get somebody who is already, quite well equipped on technology and is ahead. Because most of the times we do observe that the teacher or the staff come back and say that I learned these things from the kids, and frankly the students are already fast ahead on technology space. So to be able to catch up to that. And few other competencies where we are shifting from the traditional ones are ability to innovate, because as Rahul earlier also pointed out, you can't enter into a price war. You have to have a value that you need to deliver, and the value should be seen, not only perceived but also being seen by the end customer. So how is the teacher able to innovate and deliver the value that the school wants to give, and ultimately to have the learning happening for the child and the child itself. Plus the last point that is there, a lot of AI and VR is now coming in, and because of that you see a lot of data has started coming up, and Vishnu did touch upon that. There is a lot of data now floating in the system. How best can a teacher effectively use that? And therefore the entire understanding of data science and data engineering, and how do I convert them into metrics of performance which will help me. So in a new person that we are going to look for hiring, we are going to look at some of these aspects also, while at the core of it, I think we will definitely want to check whether the teacher, at least in a sentence, repeats 3 to 4 times the word child, 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 because that is the core of it, at the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have run out of time. I wish we had more time to, delve deeper to some of the topics that we had. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Rahul Deshpande, CEO Euroschools, Vishnu Karthik, CEO of Experiential Learning Systems and Director of the Heritage Group of Schools, B. Jairam, Chief Executive Officer at EduNation Services Private Limited. Sunita Nambiar, CEO, Kunscaps Colon, India. Rajiv Tupsakri, HR Director, North Anglia Education. Ranjan Goel, CEO, Advanced Preschools. To sum it up, I believe that the current uncertainty represents an opportunity to explore future-proof solutions to the varying issues facing the different types of schools in the Indian school system. We have tried to touch upon some of the important facets of this very interesting topic, and I look forward with a lot of optimism, hope, and positivity in the days ahead, because I'm sure we are going to change. We are going to turn out much more stronger and better in the days ahead. That's it from my side. If Vivek or Rajneesh wants to add anything before we close formally the session, I'm done from my side. Rajiv or Vivek?
Vivek, you are on mute.
Yeah, Dave, thank you so much for moderating the session extremely well. I think it's been an interesting 90 minutes of discussion, and I would just like to summarize. I was making some notes. I think very interesting points made by all the panelists. I think so. Rahul started with points of personalized education, and then also discuss about the issues related to the fees and how they've been able to tackle it on a case-to-case basis and following legal guidance and collaborating with parents. Vishnu made some very interesting points of I think no textbook till class 9, and using assessment data points and getting a dashboard for students and outcome-based tracking. And he mentioned about 21 competencies. Sunita made some beautiful points of allowing children ownership, the learning portal and personalizing education, and differentiating instructions for children. And teachers have learned to use a lot of applications, is what she mentioned, and also personal coaching, which is a part of life. And empowerment of teachers and providing the teachers with the necessary skills. And also setting aside certain resources to empower teachers. Very interesting points made by her as well. Jairam made some interesting points about rolling out the learning management system, which they have done in their organization, and also the whole sort of engagement which he's talked about with parents, the parents' engagement and collaborating with them, and parents actually embracing the change is very important. And blended learning is a way forward. Very, very valid points made by him as well. And Rajiv made some interesting points on, on the entire communication bit, the emphasis on open and transparent communication with all the stakeholders. And from a hiring perspective, very interesting points made by him in terms of both the technology part of it, in terms of ability to sort of adapt to technology, ability to deal with ambiguity, and ability to deal with oneself, in an uncertain environment. And Ranjan made very interesting points on a different topic altogether of, the utilization of the resources in terms of how we allocate tasks, how we measure performance, allocation of budgets, space utilization of infrastructure. And I think towards the end, I think in the last 15 minutes, 20 minutes, we discussed about the new education policy, with respect to it being a good vision document, experiential learning, low stakes for board exams, peer tutoring. I think very interesting point made by Jera. And how do we make teaching the profession of choice? Focus on holistic learning, emphasis on technology, and flexibility with the new policy provides with respect to higher education, setting up a separate body for assessment, and reducing the content. And as Vishnu mentioned, less is more. And I hope this gets implemented in the right spirit actually going forward. And as Dave mentioned, that this new policy discussion may actually take a day-long session. So with that hope, we might then look forward to schedule another session with you guys. Until then, I think I wish you good health. Stay safe. Thank you so much for taking out time, and we shall be in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure being here.
Pleasure.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.